Welcome to episode 314 of the Baunfire Gaming Podcast. I'm your host, Morgan, aka Baun Diesel, and this week we'll be talking about Ubisoft's continued troubles, Indiana Jones's excellent reviews, Nintendo rumors per usual, and much more. Before we get started, subscribe to the Baunfire Gaming Podcast on your favorite podcast app and leave a review on Spotify or iTunes. You can even leave comments on episodes on Spotify now, so do that. I'm sure it helps more people see them. You can also subscribe to the Baun Diesel YouTube channel to get all of my videos, including this podcast, but also game reviews, speculation videos, things like that. Go over there and check it out. Thank you to everyone who supports as a YouTube member and Twitch subscriber. If you're interested in supporting this podcast and all of my other content, please check out the link in the show description. We're going to jump into some gaming news, and we're going to start off with our main story this week. Ubisoft is shutting down XDefiant's development. It's laying off developers, shutting down 2 studios, and their future is in a little bit of question here. So just to disclose, I'm an Ubisoft creator, part of their creator team. The funny thing about that is I'm actually not even a big enough creator to actually qualify for that program. But I was a Ubisoft star player back in 2018, which was an old program they had where they would like send groups of people to PAX West or E3 back when that existed. And I actually got sent to E3 in 2018. You know, little did we know that was going to be one of the last real E3s to see the Division 2 revealed. I'm a huge Division fan. I played literally thousands of hours of the first game. I'm close to 1,000 hours of the second game. Know lots of devs there at Ubisoft Massive. So when I talk about Ubisoft, I'm a little biased. Now, I think I have some credibility because, or at least, you know, I'm biased, of course, but I kind of only like Ubisoft Massive and the Division at this point. I'm not a big fan of any other franchises anymore, or at least not for now. I was never a Splinter Cell guy. I'm kind of tired of Far Cry. Assassin's Creed is fine, I guess. Ghost Recon, I actively dislike Wildlands and Breakpoint. I really wish we got more games like Future Soldier, even though I would argue the Division is really kind of the modern version of Future Soldier. Putting all of that aside, this is a tough situation. As much as I dislike almost everything Ubisoft has done for the last 5 or 6 years at least, even the way they've honestly handled the Division 2, I'm not the biggest fan of. I do think Ubisoft holds this kind of unique position in the game industry where they're one of the few big publishers that isn't, Embracer Group, where it's this, hot mess. It's not Tencent. It's not, all of these other publishers. It's not Xbox. It's not PlayStation. They do try to do different stuff. They also do a ton of trend chasing, and it's just Ubisoft always seems like it's like 5 years behind. Like every time they've released a game, at least not one of their staple games over the last 5 or 6 years, it seems like they were, just too far behind with Hyperscape, this BR that had a really interesting twist. It was just too late. The Division Heartland, the game that ended up getting canceled, that I've been fairly public about the fact that I was part of a consultation group on that game for like 3 or 4 years, was a game that even if they would have let it come out, if that game came out in 2020, Heartlands probably would have been great, at least the BR version of it. But it was maybe going to come out in 2025, more than likely, and it was literally going to be 5 years late. XDefiant, which we're talking about here, they're shutting down development of that game. They're still going to release the 3rd season, I imagine for contractual reasons, but they're going to do refunds on things. And they're shutting down servers in 2025. That is a game where they were trying to compete with Call of Duty, and they were very vocal about that. The director of that game is a former Call of Duty a producer, director, or something like that. And like, it's commendable. Like, okay. And I've seen lots of conversation about why it failed and things like that. I played in that game. I know I played multiple betas. I think I even played an alpha test that was like missing textures and stuff. But it just never felt good. Like, I never thought it felt like a good game to play. Then on top of that, you add in this thing where they were trying to do kind of like an Overwatch Call of Duty hybrid. So it was kind of like a hero shooter, at least with your abilities and stuff. The factions you played as were factions from, multiple Ubisoft franchises. Notably, X-Defiant started off as the Division first person shooter, and then it turned into this weird amalgamation of different franchises. And I just don't think anyone cares that much about any of those specific groups. So there was supposed to be this like fandom of like, oh, I love Splinter Cell, I want to play as those guys, Echelon or whatever. I love this group, or like I think the Breakpoint antagonists were in there. Um, the funny thing for me was that it was originally a the Division game, but the only Division uh, groups you could play as were like two, I think the Cleaners, and maybe another antagonist group. It had to be hunters and shade agents. Like, it at least had to be that, and they didn't even do that. And I think that decision making and the way it came out, X Defiant just never felt like a game that was ever meant to exist, at least not to me. It just seemed like the leftovers of another game, and that's kind of how a lot of recent Ubisoft games have felt, to the point where it's easy to forget, but games like Hyperscape, and the Gods and Monsters, or whatever that ended up being called, um, literally they had a couple of years where a bunch of games they released were the leftovers of other games. I remember being told about an initiative at Ubisoft where they basically went to all their big studios and said, hey, take your existing engines, assets, make some kind of double A level game. And that is what happened. Now, some of those games never made it to market. Some did. The Gods and Monsters game, or what, Phoenix Rising, I believe, was what it eventually got called. That game was awesome. That was based off of Assassin's Creed Odyssey, I believe, was the assets and a lot of the stuff they made that game with fairly cheap. And I think it did okay. Of course, they canceled the sequel, so we'll never know. Maybe it didn't do great, but and Hyperscape, I believe, was made off of Assassin's Creed Unity, if I remember correctly. Regardless, Ubisoft's just kind of been flopping for years at this point. They, for a while, were still releasing games that were very consistently selling really well, even if their reputation was kind of, lowering. The Division 1 and 2 both have sold over 10 million copies. The Division 2 sold over 10 million copies like in the first year it existed, which at this point, that game has been out for, almost 5-6 years now. I wouldn't be surprised if it's up closer to 20 million in sales right now, which is really, really good, right? You wouldn't be able to tell from the amount of investment they've put into the post launch, but that's a different topic for a different day. But then you have situations like, they had like that Roller Champions game, which I assume was one of those games made from other assets. I couldn't tell you which game it was, but they just seem to have no direction. And when a lot of publishers run into that situation, they go back to the classics. And Ubisoft has at least acted like that's what they're doing. They said they're doing a remake of Splinter Cell. They've supposedly been working on this Beyond Good and Evil 2 game for, supposedly that was in like beta when I went to E3 in 2018, or at least it had reached some point in development. And that was, 6 years ago, almost 7 years ago. And that game seems nowhere near coming out or even being shown at this point. And so they even going back to their older reliables, they're not really doing. I believe with Ghost Recon, the next one, that I assume it's going to be made by Ubisoft Paris again, who previously was making like Just Dance games and Rayman games, and they decided to give the Ghost Recon franchise to, taking it away from Ubisoft Red Storm, who made Future Soldier and most of the games before then. So I don't expect Ghost Recon to make some big comeback. I don't know what's happening. X Defiant, it was so interesting that the main thing about X Defiant that I noticed as kind of an outsider, someone who didn't care for the game, is people seem to hate Call of Duty, the players who played it, more than they even liked X Defiant. They played X Defiant almost as like a passive aggressive hit on Call of Duty. I still remember so many people being like, "Oh, Call of Duty's in trouble. X Defiant doesn't have skill based matchmaking and blah 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 blah." And I just remember, like, after being someone who had played it in fairly early stages, being like, "What in the world are you talking about?" Like, X Defiant is not going to be around a year from now. And lo and behold, once they finally released it after its own drama with its development, it's, it's came out with a fluff, and it didn't do anything. And it's, it's likely. I think the Assassin's Creed Shadows game is probably going to be good and it's going to sell well. Even though there's certain folks on the internet really trying to discredit it and give it crap. And literally, I don't know what their next game is after Assassin's Creed. I mean, we can imagine that they're probably going to have a Far Cry game in the next couple of years. They're probably going to have that the Ghost Recon game will come eventually. We know the Division 3 is in development right now. We don't really know if it's in pre-production or full production or whatever. They tend not to really talk much about that stuff, and they keep very minimally trying to keep the Division 2 alive. Even it's so interesting how like they promote and talk about the Division 2 in the content they've been putting out in post-launch, like it's like Destiny or something that gets these really impressive huge updates, when the reality of it is it's just been a bunch of recycled content, and in my opinion, them ruining the story of the Division franchise for the last 3 or 4 years. I have some very complicated feelings about that. That may deserve its own video, but Ubisoft it's just in such a weird spot. And like my whole thing with Ubisoft is that I genuinely believe that their studios and their talent is second to none. I'm sure I have no doubt that person to person, studio to studio, they have as much talent, if not more, than most of the other publishers. Whether it's PlayStation or Xbox or gosh, I was about to say ABK, but they're Xbox now. Not many publishers left, I guess, but Square Enix and things like that, right? And I just think that the leadership that Ubisoft is a huge issue and is inept and can't do anything right and has their heads up their butts basically. And that only hurts all these studios and all the people who work at those studios, right? Oh God, Skull and Bones. I forgot that game even exists. Their quadruple A game supposedly. And and like I would argue that Ubisoft Massive, who I am super biased for, so please take that into account. I think they're as good as literally any other studio in the world. Especially if you look at it from a tech perspective, they're the developers and the people who are working on and iterating on the Snowdrop engine, which is, if you've played the Division 1 or 2, even though the Division 1 is getting closer to 10 years old and the Division 2 isn't a young pup either, are still a couple of the best looking games, especially environmentally, in my opinion, to this day. It's amazing. They're extremely in just their technical prowess is extremely good. Whether they get the credit for it or not, that's a different conversation. But where do they go? Like what's Ubisoft's next big hit game? Ubisoft is, and for quite a while has been, the pinata of the gaming industry, or at least of gamers, for people just to rip on them every time they get a chance. Many of those situations being, self-owns, things that they've kind of brought on themselves. I don't know what their path back to greatness is. We keep hearing about these acquisition rumors, and it sounds like that's imminent. It sounds like they are going to do that. But the most recent rumor I think I found out about today, I'm recording this on December 6th, is that the Gideon Wolf family, the Yves, who's the current CEO or the head of Ubisoft. Ubisoft is still owned by the family who founded it. It was 2 or 3 brothers, I believe, and only Yves is still involved. The other 2 brothers have stepped away years ago. Apparently, they're trying to work out a deal with Tencent where Tencent gets a majority of the stake, but Eves and the Guillemot family still expect to have like independent control of the company, so they aren't intending on selling out their share entirely. It's only partially, and I just like it's just like it's the most like Ubisoft thing ever. And it's not just Ubisoft, but the most like Eves or Guillemot family thing that you've ever heard, that things aren't working. Things aren't going well. Things are failing at Ubisoft. It's becoming more and more evident every single day, and especially every year. And instead of like gracefully dipping out and being like, okay, we're not the right people to be leading this company anymore. Someone else needs to take this who can, have a more modern vision on gaming and, not be so the way they are. Instead, it's, we don't want to be financially responsible for Ubisoft anymore, but we definitely want to keep making all the decisions, because they think that somehow like not being financially liable is going to make them make better decisions, when instead it's definitely just going to make them make like even like decisions that make even less sense, because now their money isn't on the line, right? Their reputation and their stakes aren't on the line anymore, and they're only going to be doing things that in theory would make money, which is what they're doing already, and they're failing miserably. It's not like ownership by another entity is going to suddenly make Eves a genius, when he, or at least it seems like he and the people around him who are currently leading Ubisoft seem to have no idea what they're doing. So it's just one of those things where it's so frustrating. And like when I saw this report about how they're trying to like maintain control of the publisher while selling off their stake in it, it just was like the most maddening thing, because that makes complete sense. Of course that's what they would do, because it's like it almost seems like they can't just acknowledge like we aren't it anymore. Like whether it's because we have just lost touch with the industry, whatever the reason is, it's just such a, I wish it was funnier, but I guess it is kind of funny. It's just like such a hilarious example of what's wrong with Ubisoft, or at least with the leadership of it, right? I've been worried for a long time that we're gonna wake up one day and find out they just dissolved the company, right? That they just dissolved Ubisoft, and then what happens to those like 20,000 plus employees? Studios like Ubisoft Massive and stuff like that, that would probably have the ability, Massive itself, which used to be an independent studio, could probably do that again, would definitely be a huge target for acquisition by PlayStations and Xboxes and, heaven forbid, Embracer Group. But I just, I don't know, man. It's tough stuff. I'm someone who's super excited about the Division 3. They've confirmed it's happening. Julian Garrity, who led the first two games, is back on it, and he's the franchise leader now. He's not just, going to be bouncing from game to game. In theory, he's going to be over the Division brand in general, a brand that's been very successful for Ubisoft, and I would argue is their strongest brand, even though Siege is somehow still extremely popular. I have no idea how it's still so popular these years later, but it is. It's probably what's keeping Ubisoft alive. X Defiant was getting assistance from Ubisoft Red Storm, who before was working on the Division Heartland, but that got canceled. And before that was working on Division 2, and they were making a DLC for a kind of the Division 1 had a mode called Survival. It was arguably the first Battle Royale mode or game that came out even before of course I'm gonna forget now. PlayerUnknown PUBG. Survival came out before PUBG, and it had, I would argue, a more interesting battle royale mode. But they didn't market it very well. They didn't push it very well. They never tried to spin it off on its own thing or whatever, and it faded, right? And it really, you'll hear the Division players say like Survival was the best mode ever, but it wasn't very popular. You couldn't get full lobbies. especially in PvP. In the PvP version of it, you could never get full lobbies outside of like the week it released and the free week they did like 2.5 years later, or 2 years later, whatever it was. It wasn't as popular as some people may make you think it was, but they were making a survival 2.0 for the Division 2. And Red Storm was doing it, and they were also the PvP balancers for the PvP modes and areas in the Division 2. And Red Storm, I believe, basically convinced Ubisoft, like, no, we have this idea for a spin-off game, which was going to be Heartland. And so instead they took some concepts from Survival 2.0 and tried to make an independent game, and it failed and crashed, when really they would have been better off just doing Survival 2.0 as a DLC for the Division 2 and probably just sticking with that. But you also can't be mad at people for ambition. Well, Red Storm has no games to work on. Supposedly they may be working on Siege, whatever it needs done. So I'm hoping that Red Storm is able to come back to Ubisoft Massive and be a support studio again, as well as some studios like Reflections in the UK and stuff like that. But I wish I was more confident that the Division 3 is ever going to happen. I'm worried. I'm worried that Ubisoft may not exist at all at some point before that game could come out, which I don't think is even in full production yet. So it's at least 3 or 4 years away, probably at minimum. I worry that they're going to get acquired, and whoever acquires them, you would think, would see this as, if not probably a priority to get Division 3 out, but maybe not. Maybe they would, I think my concern about Ubisoft getting acquired is that whoever gets them is going to cut them in half. I have no doubt. If they get bought, if they get acquired, I believe in the bottom of my heart, and the most, I hate it. I don't like this, but they're bloated. They're Ubisoft is huge, and they don't put out anything. They put out so few games for how many studios and employees they have. And anyone who acquires them, it's almost certainly going to be part of that deal is going to be probably cutting that studio in half, and laying off 5,000 to 10,000 people. So I don't know, man. It's a weird situation. I'm hoping for the best, especially because of all the people I know who are there. I'm hoping. I don't really give a crap what happens to the leadership at Ubisoft as a publisher, but I do care a lot about those studios, especially a specific few. And I really hope all the devs in those studios can kind of come through this as undamaged as possible. Moving on to a few other stories, kind of a short show this week. Indiana Jones and the Great Circle has its review embargo is up. The game is actually out as of the 6th if you have the early access. If not, it's next week. And it, last time I looked, had a Metacritic score on PC of 87, Xbox 86, and an OpenCritic score of 87. Again, this is a Xbox exclusive, but this is one of the games that they've said that I believe about 6 months from now will be coming out on PlayStation. It's either 6 months or a year. I can't remember. These scores are great. I've been pretty open about. I think this game has shown awful. I think that the preview event that they did, a lot of the feedback from that was kind of mixed. I think the trailers looked not great for this game, but I always did kind of wonder, like, is this going to be a game that plays really well, that is fun to experience? It just doesn't show very well, which there's plenty of games like that. And it seems like that's the case. Those scores, those Metacritic scores are extremely good. There's a few outlets like VGC, Jordan Midler, who I have found tends to not be very optimistic or willing to give Xbox much credit, and tends to be kind of a negative Nancy in general. I think gave it a 10 out of 10, or at least a 9 out of 10. I think it was 5 stars on their review scale, which is wild. Like, I would have never guessed that. And we had people like Lucy James and Danny O'Dwyer of GameSpot and of the No Clip documentary series, both saying it may be their game of the year. That's a year where we've had a lot of really, really good games. We've had good games that aren't even being talked about for Game of the Year. Like for me, Hellblade 2: Senua's Saga is probably my second or third favorite game this year, and it isn't even being mentioned because it was too short or whatever. So, I the reaction to the Indiana Jones game has taken me from a point where I was probably just gonna skip it. I don't love like first person adventure games. I like first person shooters, which it doesn't seem like this game really is. You can technically shoot, but from the reviews I've seen, that's not really the best way to play the game. It's taken me from where I was probably gonna skip this to I'm at least gonna try it out. Um, yeah, it's interesting that there was even feedback to the point where I saw people being like, this is the best game that Xbox has published in multiple generations," and it's like, dang, okay, like because I really like a lot of the games they've released, even in the last couple of years, with Starfield and Redfall, of course, but no, like Starfield and Forza, and Hellblade and stuff like that. I almost said Helldivers. Um, so yeah, I'm honestly just kind of bewildered. I'm confused. Even Digital Foundry did a big review of it, and from a technical aspect, it's like masterful. They're extremely impressed with how it runs on the Xboxes, on both of them. Even though S is obviously, you know, it's pretty low tier, but for what it's doing, they seem very impressed. I saw a lot of people complaining about the PC requirements, but it sounds like they were just kind of being cautious with what they were wanting people to expect. But it seems like it runs really well. I've not seen any big mention of like bugs or technical issues with the game. Yeah, apparently it's great. Apparently it's just, it seems like there's a lot of people who are hung up on wishing it was like fully a first person game or fully third person. Some people who just don't like Indiana Jones in general, which is like kind of where I'm at. I'm not like, I don't dislike Indiana Jones, but I kind of don't care about the franchise either. So I definitely don't go into it with that. But it seems like the visuals, the story, the puzzles, the voice acting is getting a lot of praise. It seems like all that stuff is excellent, and it's taken me from not having any interest in the game at all to at least trying it out and seeing if I can get through it. I guess there's a lot of side content, but it sounds like you can get through the main quest in like 15 hours. And so that's a thing I'm willing to do. I'm about to wrap up Stalker 2, and which we'll talk about here shortly, but I need something to play. Otherwise I just go back to playing more Mass Effect or something like that, which is fine, but we'll see. So Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, Machine Games doesn't miss, apparently. I've been saying that for a while, and it seems like I was right, as well as a bunch of other people. We've got our Nintendo rumors again. Bilbo Coon, I believe, is their name on Twitter, I think they have their own website. I need to start maybe referencing things better here. Be on the lookout for that in 2025. I'll try to do a better job of referencing all these stories. But the rumor is that Nintendo is going to reveal the next hardware in January, is going to have some kind of event in the following months to show off the hardware, and then we'll release it in early summer. Okay, sure, let's do it. It was interesting. I saw a commentator today saying like, I hope this time they like really come out swinging about how powerful this is and how it competes with the big boys with Xbox and PlayStation. I think that is a insane expectation of this console. I still subscribe to the rumors that they've had the hardware specs for this system locked down for like 4 years. So that I am almost willing to guarantee that they're going to advertise DLSS on this new hardware. It's using NVIDIA CPU and GPU tech. I'm willing to bet that we're going to find out that it's limited to like DLSS 2, which we're currently on, 4 or 5, I think. I'm willing to bet that we're going to find a piece of hardware that even if they set the hardware spec years ago, I'm sure there's small things they could change. I'm willing to bet that we're going to find this system to be not really up to date when it comes out, which is what happened with the Switch as well. Now, the Switch specifically was outdated the day it released because it was using some mobile hardware. I believe it was NVIDIA as well. That was like really outdated when it came out. And This will probably be a little more modern, maybe. But let me be clear, it won't matter. It will play games better than the Switch, obviously. It's probably going to be like 5 times more powerful, but it probably won't even be close to the Series S. But it won't matter. None of that matters. The Switch was outdated the day it came out. It's woefully outdated today. And they've sold like 130 million of them. And their games sell like hotcakes every time they release literally anything. They've released Pokemon games that run at like 10 FPS, and people bought like 10 million copies of it. It doesn't matter. When we talk about how Nintendo and Sony and Xbox are all doing, we compare them because they're the 3 big platforms as well as PC. We compare Xbox and PlayStation and Nintendo, but you kind of can't. I don't think you can anymore. You've got Xbox doing the subscription thing and not caring about their hardware that much. You've got PlayStation obsessed with their hardware still and their first party exclusives. And then you've got Nintendo, caring about mobile or being focused on gameplay and their big first party titles. And they're all just doing such different things, and people still try to compare hardware unit sales and all this stuff, and it's useless. It's pointless. I think it's really interesting, and I'm wondering when the greater gaming community, influencers, journalists are finally going to catch up and realize, like, oh man, like these may be competing platforms technically, but we really need to start covering these companies as almost doing 3 completely different things, because that's what they're doing. Even to this day, you'll see so much reference to PlayStation winning the console war because it's selling more hardware units than Xbox. But that doesn't really talk about revenue. We saw the documents from a few years ago that suggested even though PlayStation's making more money than Xbox or Nintendo, it's bringing home, its profit margin is way lower than both of them, and it's taking back less cash because they're spending so much money on game development and stuff like that. Where Nintendo is profiting, even though it makes less money. Them and Xbox, I think, made similar amounts of money in the time period that was referenced. But Nintendo's profit margin is so high, it made more profit off of less money than Xbox and PlayStation made together in profit. So it's just like Nintendo is just such a abnormality in the industry. The way they're doing things is so different, and their goals are so different, and they're working so well for them. It doesn't matter if this new hardware is probably not going to be that great. It's probably going to be very mediocre hardware, and it won't matter because they're going to put games on it that people love and that are really, really good. And even if they run like crap, even from day one, even if they don't run great the year next year when it comes out, they probably will. But even if it doesn't, it won't matter. It just won't matter. They're going to sell 100 million units of it, and each game they put out for it, a major game, is going to sell 10 million copies. And they're never going to discount any of those things. Like, it's wild. I'm not a big Nintendo fan. I plan on buying whatever they put out next year. For myself, I think my wife would actually probably play it, and for our daughter. It will be the first Nintendo console I've owned since my translucent purple Game Boy Color. I didn't get a GameCube. I didn't have an N64 before that. I didn't get a Wii. I didn't have a Wii U. I never got a Switch. Because by the time I kind of wanted one, I realized, like, I'm not going to buy something that already is way outdated. I'll just wait for the next thing that's only a little outdated, and that's what I'm going to do. So I'm excited to jump in. The cool thing for me is I've got like 20 years of Nintendo games to catch up on. So even if their new system and their new games don't run that well, I bet it's going to run backwards compatible on a bunch of those games extremely well. So you may see this turn into a Nintendo podcast in 2025. We'll have to wait and see. I spoke earlier about S.T.A.L.K.E.R 2. I'm literally probably like 30 minutes away from finishing it. It turned into one of those games that for the first like third, I was exploring everything, doing all the side missions. And then I started to be like, oh God, this is going to be like 100 hours if I don't push. And I've been pushing the probably the last 2/3 of the game, and it's still, I'm around like 50 or 60 hours. I think it's my second most played game on Xbox or PC this year. So keep that in mind, like how crazy that is. S.T.A.L.K.E.R 2 is such an interesting game because if it didn't have the technical issues it has in some of the gameplay stuff. I'd be looking at like a 9.5 or a 10 out of 10. It's the story, the cinematics, the characters, the world, the environments, most of the graphics, the gunplay are excellent. But there's been times where I started it up and 30 seconds later it shut down and crashed. There's a really obvious memory leak in this game where if you're in the wrong places, or if things just happen the wrong way, your RAM just gets overloaded and it just shuts the game down. And so I assume that's a big thing they're probably working on right now. There's also some actual gameplay issues I have with the game. It's got like Dragon's Dogma 2 syndrome a little bit, where it has such an obnoxious fast travel system where basically all the major bases have a guide who you can do fast travel with if you pay. Similar to how Dragon's Dogma 2 has the carts that you can do. At least it doesn't have Dragon's Dogma, its awful system where your cart always gets stopped in the middle of its journey and attacked, and can even be destroyed, and you wasted your money and you have to walk the rest of the way anyways. Man, I hate that game. I can't wait to talk about my top 10 games this year, because at the end I'm just gonna rip on Dragon's Dogma 2 so hard. So Stalker 2 does have a few of those issues. You'll have a situation where you'll have like 3 story missions, and you'll go to a place, you'll do the thing there for 5 or 10 or 20 minutes, whatever the mission takes. Then they'll say, hey, you got to go over to this place and talk to this guy. And it's a 3-kilometer walk, which really doesn't take that long, especially if you just beeline it. What this is supposed to do, I think, is if you're someone who's playing the game very naturally and casually, you start walking towards that and you find this little settlement. So you clear out the mutants from that and get the loot, and then you continue on to the main objective, and then you run across this industry building, this industrial building, and you go into it and clear out this mutant and get all the loot from that. And played more casually, it's probably not as obnoxious, but with me, these last 2/3 of the game, just wanting to finish it and just to see how it ends, it's pretty tedious. But that said, I don't care, because the things that Stalker 2 does right, if you can get past the crashes, you can get past the obnoxious gameplay, mechanics, and some of the decisions in the game, the way that enemies spawn. They have this terrible system that apparently they're working on, where it's a radial spawn system for enemies. So enemies just spawn on you. There aren't enemies out in the world that you come upon. It just decides that an enemy needs to spawn right behind you in a given moment. And in the outside areas, it's not too obnoxious. But right now, I'm at the end of the game and I'm in a more congested area, which it means that literally you can turn and see nothing. You killed all the enemies. You can turn to face other enemies, and 2 seconds later, in the place that you just cleared, 4 enemies will pop up, and now you have to turn and kill them. And it gets to the point where you just run through everything. You just stop trying to kill things because you realize it's like an infinite spawn thing. And once you realize the way it's working, you just have to bounce. Like if you sit there forever, you're just going to be killing things forever. You're going to run out of ammo and you're going to end up dying anyways. So Stalker 2 isn't perfect, but the things it does so well that it's definitely in my top 5 this year. And it may even climb. I don't think I think it's still too flawed to really become my favorite game this year. But it's definitely, I thought it might crack my top 10 this year. I wasn't super invested in it, but I was that looks kind of cool. And it's become a game that, I will probably play off and on for years at this point, especially as they fix things and improve things. So, yep, Stalker 2, I should have that review out next week. I assume I'll finish the game probably tonight or at least this weekend. And then I'll do some kind of more comprehensive review on it. So be on the lookout for that on my YouTube channel. It's also Bon Diesel. A few small stories here. Forza Motorsport is getting RTGI ray tracing on PC. This was something that some people were kind of miffed that this wasn't included with the game when it came out. Even also miffed that it wasn't on the PlayStation Series X or S. I mean, come on, like if you understand any of this PC tech and how all these things work. No one should have ever really expected that. And even on PC, it's probably gonna be pretty beefy. So if you're still a Forza head and you're playing that, I really enjoyed that game. I just, I had my month with it and then I moved on. That's a cool update for people who are still into it. Sean Layden, formerly of PlayStation, confirmed that PS2 sold over 160 million units. I've heard this conversation off and on over the years that like PlayStation and people who work there or used to work there and fans are like so obsessed with this. I guess it's because the Switch has sold over 130 million units, and there was this conversation of like, oh, is the Switch going to be the highest selling console ever? And it seems like Sony really doesn't want that to be a thing, because I believe at one point people thought that the PlayStation 2 sold around 140 million units. And since then, it's been a big, like the closer the Switch got, the more the conversation came up, and now they're saying 160 million. That wouldn't surprise me though, at all. I remember I worked at GameStop here in the United States from 2006 until around 2010, or 2007 to 10, around then. So you're talking about when the 360 and PS3 were well established and been out for years, were the current console. I remember even the day I left, we were still getting brand new PS2 Slims in inventory and selling them because they were really cheap. And there were so many games for them. We still sold the used games for them. There were even new games. Was it like FIFA or in Madden, I think, came out for PS2. I don't know the year off the top of my head, but they made versions of those games probably 5 or 10 years longer than you think they did. Now, the thing to know about them, and I remember this from talking to some people back then, was there was no advancement in them. FIFA, say it was FIFA 2010 on PS2, was FIFA 2002. Like and it was just updated rosters and uniforms and stuff. And I'm sure there were some improvements they made, but very, very minimal. They were not anywhere near, evolving with the games on the 360 and PS3. And I don't know when they stopped selling those brand new PS2s, but I wouldn't be surprised at all if it was right around the time the PS4 and the Xbox One generation happened. I wouldn't be surprised at all if they were still getting new PS2s in stock. So it's selling 160 million units, not surprising at all. The PS2 was easily the most popular console that we sold consoles and games for, even in 2010 when I left GameStop. It was pretty crazy. Followed probably, obviously the 360 and PS3 were a big deal. But like GameCube was surprisingly popular. The original Xbox and was somewhat, not nearly as much, but yeah. So PS2 probably going to hold that record forever, especially with the way hardware is going. Alana Pierce, this was a pretty big story, bigger than I expected. Alana Pierce, formerly of, was like Rooster Teeth, and she did like a podcast, the Xbox podcast on Kind of Funny, is leaving Santa Monica, Sony Santa Monica, where she was, I believe, one of the kind of intro, or one of the writers on that team, due to some personal reasons and some other projects she wants to pursue. This was a weird one to me because I like Alana a lot. I've always kind of vibed with her takes on a lot of things, for the most part. And I don't know why this was such a big story. It's the only reason I put it in here. I mean, obviously, if it was any other, like kind of entry level writer at a game studio, there would be no articles about them. Obviously, Alana has a larger influence. She's even gone into like film and stuff. If you have ever heard of the Dead Meat YouTube channel that summarizes and does kill counts on horror movies, they recently did one where she was in a horror movie as an actress, or as a writer. I can't remember what her role was in it. So, someone who's doing things, who's pretty well known in multiple industries. But at the end of the day, even on the aggregator, the news aggregator I use to make much of my topics on this podcast, it was mentioned, and I don't know, it's weird. but good for her. Kind of not good for her, the reason she's leaving, some personal stuff. She has a YouTube video if you want to go see her talk about it. It does suck. It sounds like that job at Sony Santa Monica was a dream job and she loved it, and she's leaving not entirely because she wants to. They didn't fire her. She chose to leave, but it does suck, especially if you've ever been in the situation that she's in, which I kind of have been. But yeah, I don't know. I just thought it was a weird story that was even talked about, but there we go. And then the final story, Bloober Team has announced that they have started their next project after the release of Silent Hill 2's remake. That'll be interesting. Silent Hill 2, that remake was received extremely well. It's got a lot of not Game of the Year awards, but it's been nominated for a lot of different awards from a lot of different places. The reviews of it were extremely positive. The industry in general, or at least journalists and influencers, have always, from what I've noticed, been kind of suspicious of Bloober. They've definitely had kind of up and downs with their games, but this one seems to have hit, and it seems to have convinced a lot of people they know what they're doing. And so there's this question about, like, what do they do next? Are they going to do more remakes of like established titles? Are they finally going to do something maybe that's a little more original, or like a sequel to a series? Like, could they do like a new Silent Hill game? We'll have to wait and see. I didn't really have anything for content updates this week. I'm really busy with work here in the busy season, and the holidays and all of that. So I'm putting out content as I can, including this podcast. So please support what I am able to put out. They recently had the Spotify year-end review. So if my show, if this podcast is in your, kind of end of the year highlight, please tag me on social media, and I will retweet that and show everyone that there are still some people who listen to this podcast, and I very much appreciate those that do. But yeah, that's kind of all I have for this one. So we'll wrap this thing up. If you have your own topics, questions, or feedback, be sure to let me know in my Discord, in the YouTube comments, or hit me up on social media at Bondiesel or at the Baunfire on all of the platforms. That is all I have for this episode of the Baunfire Gaming Podcast. Thank you so much for listening, and until next time.